masticatory muscles, cranial nerve 5. Mandibular branch of cranial nerve 5. These other two branches of cranial nerve 5 are strictly sensory. Now we look around for other things that we can see here in terms of other nervous structures. We have one there, a tubular structure here, and another nervous structure there. That's the cheek, the buccal part of the face. So those are buccal branches of cranial nerve 7. I didn't say buccal nerve, I said buccal branches of cranial nerve 7. Useful in terms of giving something like a horse with a heavy head some facial paralysis by laying their head too long on those nerves which cross the base of the masseter muscle nerves. The dorsal buccal branch, ventral buccal branch of the facial nerve, cranial nerve 7, and then in the middle we have this tubular structure draining that big salivary gland there, which is the parotid duct, which empties opposite the upper fourth cheek tooth right in here. If you can find that in your cat or dog, then great. If you can't, move on to something else. If you understand that it empties there, then that's sufficient. Okay, so now parotid salivary gland, then we start looking for other glandular structures, and here's a big one. The largest structure that you're going to be able to palpate or see there is the mandibular salivary gland. That's that big puppy here, located just behind the mandible. Now, associated with that, and the number will vary, are one or two or several mandibular lymph nodes. So salivary gland, lymph nodes. Two different things. Now, what else can we see here if we start moving this away from there and try to kind of lift it up? And I'm sort of picking it up there by an additional salivary gland, which shares the capsule with the mandibular gland. Nature also put the sublingual salivary gland in that same capsule, and it's located kind of dorsal there. Now, what's the big deal about salivary glands and their position here? This one empties opposite the upper fourth cheek tooth. These two empty beneath the tongue. So we take this over and roll it out and say, if you look at this mucosa here in your dissection, you'll be able to find the paired ducts of the mandibular and the sublingual. Two ducts, one for each of those glands. And those lead us to kind of a bump here under the tongue, which isn't that evident in this dissected specimen. Kind of a little bump there under the tongue. So under the tongue would be sublingual. And the little bump is just like that little bump in the corner of the eye. It's a caruncle. So in this case, it's a sublingual caruncle. That's where the empty point is for sublingual and mandibular. And then the empty point for parotid is up here opposite the upper cheek. I'll show you a picture in the lecture of a plugged duct, a ranula. It looks like a big sausage laying in here, and that tells you, when you look at that, you instantly know it's probably a salivary gland duct that is blocked. Okay, so back to the other side now. We're over here at these things, looking around for things we can recognize. If I start poking around up in this region and look beneath the eye, in the skull, there's an infraorbital foramen. Arising from that infraorbital foramen, fished out where we go, is the infraorbital artery, vein, and nerve. And since that bone is the maxilla, the nerve that gives rise to that infraorbital, that's sensory to this whole region of the face, is the infraorbital nerve, and it's a branch of cranial nerve 5, trigeminal, bone, maxillary. And it's entirely sensory to this part of the face. Now there are muscles here. What innervates those muscles? Cranial nerve 7, or muscles of facial expression. Now there's an artery, vein, and a nerve there. If we follow those back, there'll be continuous structures called maxillary arteries and maxillary nerves. Okay, so what do we got? What else can we do here with muscles? If we look for a muscle that makes a ring around the eye, whenever you do this, you're activating your orbicularis oculi muscle, sphincter-like muscle. When you do this, you're activating your orbicularis oris muscle. A ring around the lips, a ring around the lips here, and a ring around the eye. Again, both muscles of facial expression, so cranial nerve 7. If we move to this region of the cheek here, right there's a buccalis muscle. When you blow your cheek up, like that. That muscle there is the buccalis muscle, forms the wall of your cheek. It's a muscle of facial expression to back to cranial nerve 7. So if you can't remember anything else on the cranial nerve on the head, you're probably safe to put the 7.
Yeah.
That might bite you, but hopefully not. All right, what else can we see from the outer surface here that's of note? I'll miss some things, but that's all right. If you don't see it here, you'll see it on the test. Oh, bad joke, bad joke. Okay, what else can we see here? If we start looking at the ventral part here. In between the mandible and the mandible there's a muscle that bridges that whole region. When you push up under between your mandible, that muscle you're pushing on is called the mylohyoides. Mylohyoides. So this makes the bridge in this intermandibular space. So that's what we're looking at here.
So it goes, is it like a chin strap that goes this way, or it
well,
goes
but
like
it's
this
a wide chin strap. It spans this whole region.
Okay.
And you'll see the cut edge of it whenever you do some of your resection. Now, we did temporalis.
Where's it?
Right here.
No, the temporalis.
The temporalis. We did temporalis up here on top of the head. That dog that Roddy with the mascatory myositis. The muscle that's atrophied is the temporalis. Now the big one here on the face of the jaw that you see when you clench your teeth, that muscle you see moving, that is the masseter. And same here. Now there's a muscle that we can't see in this dissection, and that would be the third group of big muscles of mastication. I'll show you a picture today, and that's called the pterygoids. We pick up the skull, on the bottom part of the skull, look at your diagram, there's going to be a thing called a pterygoid process. Ptery refers to a wing. It's kind of a wing-looking thing on the skull. Pterygoid process is where those muscles arise. That's our other group of muscles to close the jaw. Temporalis, masseter, and pterygoids. Put all those three things together, you've got the muscles that close, and that brings us to this one. There's a two-bellied muscle here. If I shorten that muscle, you can see that it would open the animal's jaw, so that would be the two-bellied muscle. Gaster means belly. Digastricus must mean the two-bellied muscle. It's called two bellies because there are two bellies, and they have different innervations. One of those heads is innervated by the facial nerve. Kind of a weird deal. Nature said maybe we better take steps to be sure an animal can open its mouth, so we'll give it dual innervation. Our quiet period is over. Anyway, I have the digastricus muscle here, so it's going to be innervated by cranial nerve 5, mandibular, and cranial nerve 7, facial. All right, now, what else can we do from this side here? Any questions about this kind of general surface anatomy? There's some other muscles here. There's a levator nasolabialis there, the snarl muscle that enables the animal to do that. Okay. And then then down in this region here, there's a hole in the skull there called the mental foramen. Mentum means chin. So this region right here is innervated by the mental nerve, and if we follow it back, it's associated with a nerve in that bone, so it must be a branch of the trigeminal, specifically this bone,
the
mandibular nerve. Mandibular nerve gives rise to the mental nerve, which is sensory to the chin. So the mandibular is kind of the complicated one. It has motor function, it has sensory function, whereas the other two branches are strictly sensory. That maxillary, and then if we start touching around the eye here, it's ophthalmic. And if we touch the cornea, that's ophthalmic also. Two sensory, one motor. Okay, where else are we going with this? If we start poking around and looking at the surface here, you've done some strap muscles, haven't you? You pick up that strap muscle and that strap muscle, set them aside there and say this one here appears to be going to the thyroid cartilage. And it is. You know that it began in the sternum. So that must be the sternothyroides. Then you pick this other one up and you can see it's going to a bony structure there. The basihyoid. That must be the sternothyroides.
Yeah.
Couple them together down here where they join together and they're the sternothyroides. Okay, strap muscles there that enable you to move aside and be able to visualize the trachea. Now what else can we see from this view? We'll do the larynx here by itself in just a moment. Let's go to the other side. And look at this. Several striking things jump out and slap you. One is the tongue. About the only muscle I think we ask you to know on the tongue is the genio. Kind of refers to the bend of the mandible there. So there's a genioglossus, which is the main muscle of the tongue. There's a geniohyoideus here, which is also associated with the tongue. And the name implies that it must arise from the hyoid apparatus and be a portion of the tongue, hence the name geniohyoideus. This is genioglossus, so the tongue muscle originating here from the chin region. All right, and that's cranial nerve, tongue muscle.
Oh, 12. Hypoglossal.
Yeah, hypoglossal. Cranial nerve 12. So now we've looked at tongue here. And we start looking at other structures of the head here. There's a bony, hard palate, which has these little ridges in it called rugae. You can feel those in the roof of your own mouth with your tongue. And if we move back further and get to the end of the line of the bony, hard palate, there is a soft palate. The soft palate begins there and terminates right back here. So that soft palate, if I look above it, I get one of the pharynx cavities, and that would be the nasopharynx, which is above the soft palate. And then beneath the soft palate in this region is the oropharynx, nasopharynx, oropharynx, and then this is the entrance to the larynx, and this cavity above the entrance to the larynx is the laryngopharynx. Put them all together, they spell pharynx. When you say pharynx, there are three parts: naso, oro, and lingo. Laryngo, pharynx. All right, what else can we find in this room? If we look in that nasopharynx, there's an opening here that leads me to the middle ear. Not to the inner ear, but the middle ear. When you land in an airplane, your head gets all stopped up, and you start swallowing, then that passageway will open, allow air into your middle ear cavity and equalize the pressure on either side of the tympanic membrane, and you feel better. Okay, we have a pharyngeal opening of the auditory tube. You may have heard it called Eustachian tube. In human anatomy, they refer to it as Eustachian tube. We call it the auditory tube. It has to do with hearing. So auditory tube, and that's the pharyngeal opening, part of this nasopharynx. Now, other structures of the head in this region, this probe here is lying in a passageway. Passageway in the nasal cavity is a meatus. So we have a ventral meatus, and then there are passageways that lead into these bones that are dead-ended, and that would be the middle meatus. And then there's one up here. If we follow it again, it will be dead-ended, and that will be the dorsal nasal meatus. And then, connecting all of those together, the space here, which is common, so that would be the common meatus. Dorsal meatus, middle meatus, and ventral meatus. Of those three, the most significant one is the ventral nasal meatus, because that's the pathway for a nasogastric tube. If you try to insert the tube through the other passageways, you will damage these conchi or turbinates and create a nosebleed, epistaxis. And that's what these bones are that serve to humidify and condition the air as the animal breathes it. All of these conchi or turbinates, either term is accepted. So meatices and conchi or turbinates, and we've kind of concluded the discussion of the nasal cavity there. And that the sensation there is carried again by, for smell, cranial nerve 1, and for pain, cranial nerve 5. Now, the other structure I see that's kind of weird in this area, there's a big space here associated with the skull. It's up in front, so that must be a frontal sinus. Dog has a prominent frontal sinus and then a very small maxillary sinus here, but the most significant air-filled cavity in their skull is the frontal sinus.
If tumors form You know how you can sometimes